Hello, everyone. Tonight we will relax with the story Strange Things That Medieval People Did for Fun. You are standing in the middle of a bustling medieval village, where the sounds of music from damp wooden flutes and drums beaten by bare hands echo through the cobblestone alleys. The stale summer air mixed with the scents of roasting meat, dried straw, and unwashed human breath makes your senses more alert than ever. Children chase each other between stalls, and adults are drunk and dancing in woolen clothes so thick you could almost imagine them being knitted from raw sheep. But what stops you in your tracks is a scream. No, a real scream, followed by a loud clap of hands and a sharp object whizzing past your head. Welcome to blind singing and axe throwing, the unofficial favorite sport of medieval village fairs. You see a man standing in the middle of a circle of onlookers, his eyes covered with a cloth so dirty it almost looks like a biological weapon. He is screaming a tune that is either a hymn or the lament of a chronic insomniac, while in his other hand he holds a small axe, the kind that today is used to cut firewood. But in the hands of excited villagers, it becomes a deadly tool of entertainment. No scoreboard, no coach. It's just axes, shouting, and blind faith in luck. You suddenly realize this is no joke. On the sidelines of the playground is a jejun, elderly woman in a silver mesh cap, watching intently, until the axe flies off the edge and crashes into the wood next to her head. Everyone laughs. She shrugs and hands the axe to the next player. A disheveled, grinning young man who looks like he just crawled out of a haystack steps up to take the challenge, swings the axe around with determination, and hits himself in the leg. You hear a crack and a laugh that's just as bone-chilling. Sounds crazy, maybe. But historical records show that in medieval England and France, fairs were not just for trade, but also for villagers to show off their unusual abilities. Some accounts mention blindfold singing games that involved the louder the merrier, while instinctive weapon-throwing competitions were banned in some parishes because the number of injuries was too great for the church to bear. Why did people indulge in such things? Historians are still debating whether it was a sign of an underlying culture of violence, or simply because there was no TikTok to entertain them. Some say it was a way to relieve the stress of a hard life. Others say people simply enjoyed organized chaos, the same way you can watch someone eat a level 100 chili pepper on YouTube and laugh for no reason. Another oddity: those who sang loudest and threw the axe the farthest were often chosen to be keepers of the church for the following year. It seems that the ability to intuitively throw an axe was a valuable leadership quality in an age when everything could fall apart at the drop of a mouse. You duck into a nearby stall to avoid the next hail of axes. The vendor hands you a rock-hard honey cake and advises you to suck on it for at least 20 minutes before trying to bite it. Across the street, a woman recounts how last year her husband accidentally threw an axe and hit a pig in the stomach. But instead of getting angry, the villagers celebrated and had a barbecue on the spot. It was a godsend, she says, chewing and smiling as the sun sets and the light begins to fade. You hear the gong that signals the final round of the brainless axe throwing. Fat, shirtless, muddy guy steps out, raises his axe in a royal salute, then turns and throws it over his shoulder. It arcs around and hits the target. A cake hanging in the middle of the courtyard falls and shatters, and everyone cheers as if they've won the Battle of Agincourt. You wonder if the world will ever turn around and let you out of here, but a child just thrusts a blindfold into your hands. You look at him, looks at you. Welcome to the game. You wake up from a nightmare of an axe falling on your foot, only to realize the meowing in your ears was no hallucination. As you turn off the main road, the light from torches illuminates a large room in the nobleman's mansion. The door swings open, revealing a scene that even a fever dream would have been hard to imagine. On a stage made of upturned wine barrels and greasy tablecloths, Four cats stood on their hind legs. They wore lace dresses and little boots and danced to the music of a flute. It's not in a messy way. In a rhythmic dance, with head swivels like four-legged ballerinas. The corner, a hen pushed a toy cart with her beak, and on top of it was a radish doll wearing a crown. No one applauded. They were too busy crying with laughter. You're not dreaming. You're witnessing a real form of entertainment, a medieval animal circus. Cats in many European cultures at that time were not only pets, but also magical symbols, believed to bring good luck or misfortune depending on the cat's mood. The nobility, especially the bored kings and queens, came up with the idea of training them to perform tricks. Unfortunately, no cat would do tricks when told, so the trainer had to dress up like a cat to instruct. A notable historical event. In 1393, at the famous French royal banquet called Dardenne Ball, King Charles VI and a group of nobles dressed as dancing wild animals, including cats. The event ended in a toast. The event ended in a huge fire and several deaths, but this did not stop the trend of animal entertainment from spreading throughout the regions. And what about the circus chicken? Medieval people had a strange relationship with poultry. They were seen as more than just food. They were also seen as symbolic creatures. Chickens kept time, crowed in the morning, and when they couldn't lay eggs fast enough, they were put to work as performers. An ancient German scroll records the festival chicken dance, where hens are dressed in sweaters and paraded across the table. The winner is the one with the most expression. Yes, expression. Imagine trying to gauge the emotions of a chicken in pajamas. Curiously, there were even schools of animal handling in the 14th, 15th centuries. The tuition wasn't cheap. But if you could teach a ferret to wear pants and pat a distinguished guest on the head, you'd be invited to every big party. Some modern scholars still debate whether this was a form of animal cruelty or just a cultural expression of the times. One camp says there was no better option, so it was reasonable to watch the cat dance. The other camp says just hearing about the chicken costume is enough to make that conclusion. The problem is, there is no record of the cat's true feelings. Perhaps it despised the whole event. You look back at the stage. A man bearded and in a red tunicus, holding a violin, playing a piece called Dance for Dreaming Mice. Meanwhile, the largest cat in a crown is shuffling across the stage, half dancing, half glaring at the audience. Someone shouts, "There! Look at him glaring. He won." You take a step back, trying not to step on the hen that is taking a break. Next to you, an older woman sighs and says, "In the old days, cats only caught mice. Now they can perform comedy skits." You sit down on a rickety wooden chair, trying to make sense of what is happening. Maybe you ate poisoned bread, or maybe this is the Middle Ages. The music started again. A group of young flute players stepped out, leading a goat wearing a paper crown. It slowly climbed onto the platform, bowed, peed directly on the violin. Thunderous applause broke out. The performers laughed heartily. The main cat stepped out and bowed. You're about to leave. But then you're drawn in by a sign hanging in the corner of the stage. Tomorrow night, circus with mice and ladybugs. Free tickets, food for sale. You may never look at cats the same way again. You're still recovering from the cat show. When the shouts from the main square jolt you back to reality, or rather, to an alternate reality where absurdity reigns as an unwritten law. You walk toward the jostling crowd and spot a makeshift wooden fence with flags flying, red and yellow ribbons fluttering in the afternoon breeze. Scrawled in chalk on it are the words, "Annual Backwards Horse Riding Tournament for Real Men." Only you raise your eyebrows. Then you see it. A knight in shining armor, or at least what used to be shining, was riding a shaggy horse. That is, his back was to the horse's head, his face was turned backwards, his arms were flailing as if he were performing some kind of strange dance. Ames' feet were kicking wildly, and he was shouting love poems. "Oh, your heart is like the chopping board I used to chop onions every afternoon." Laughter rang out everywhere. Some people clapped, others held their stomachs and laughed. You looked closely at the rules board hanging on the pole. The contestant must ride his horse backward at least 3 times around the field, reciting his poem without dropping his hat. Anyone who falls off early will be smeared with goose. Fat. This was no silly game played by a group of idle youths. Rather, it was an annual event organized by the town itself, in honor of a knight who had fled from battle on horseback, but accidentally shouted poetry on the run. The townspeople considered it heroic in defeat, and since then, every year, men in the area have raced to ride their horses backward, both for fun and to demonstrate reverse chivalry. It sounds funny, but many medieval regions had similar bizarre competitions. In 13th century England, some towns held fools, carnival parades, feast of fools, where all the rules were reversed. Priests played clowns, peasants wore crowns, and there were even donkey riding competitions to demonstrate their poetry recitation skills. Such occasions, according to researchers, were the only times when ordinary people could mock the nobility and the church with impunity. A kind of social venting. However, historians still debate whether such order-reversing games were a form of covert rebellion or just villagers having too much free time. One theory is that these types of festivals helped maintain order in the long term by allowing villagers to pemperebriac the rules. Another theory is they just wanted to see who would fall first. Back to you. Now the next person has entered the yard. A skinny young man wearing a scarlet cloak that seems to have been borrowed from the troupe. He is sitting upside down on his horse, holding a scroll with a love poem in his hand. The horse moves slowly. The rider sways like a seasick person. He shouts, "Your heart is like a loaf of bread, cold from yesterday." The audience applauded. But then, pop, one foot slipped. The young man fell, his cloak caught in the saddle. An old woman who seemed to be the referee stepped out, took a lump of goose fat from her pocket, and smeared it on his forehead. He who falls loses. But he who falls with poetry is still honored, she declared. You laugh. But then you realize something. In a world filled with war, famine, and disease, sometimes the only thing that makes you feel in control of your life is riding a horse backwards. Church bells rang in the distance. Man, dusty-faced, hunched with laughter, waved you over, holding out a glass of cider. "Want a taste?" he asked. "Tomorrow night's semi-final. Short-handed." You hesitate. But then again, riding a horse backwards and reading poetry about cold? Bread isn't exactly the strangest thing you'll see in this place. You still feel sick to your stomach from laughing as you turn into a small stone alley, where the smell of grilled meat and wood smoke hangs in the air like a warm blanket over the village. Laughter, ringing bells, and especially a faint moaning sound echoes from a large courtyard next to the church. You curiously step closer, and then you see something that would make anyone swallow their saliva, literally and figuratively. A long line of fat men, red-faced and dripping with sweat, sat around a long table piled high with meat pies fresh from the oven. The pies were still steaming. The crusts were so puffed up that they looked as if the touch would send hot fillings squirting out like little lava. A man in a black cloak and a woolen cap stepped into the middle of the courtyard, holding a silver bell and striking it 3 times. "Skin," he shouted, and there was a chorus of gasps and squeals as the contestants bite into the cake. Think modern spicy eating contests are gross? Wait until you see medieval eating contests. Meat pie. The winner is the one who can swallow 3 of them without passing out. Not spicy, not big, but hot enough to burn your lips and tongue. And if you stop chewing before the church bells ring, you lose. If you scream too hot, you're disqualified. And if you accidentally throw up on the table, you have to wipe it with your shirt. A 14th century document details a similar competition in the English countryside, where villagers competed to eat pies filled with lambs, heart, and onions, straight from the stone oven. There was no time to cool. That was part of the challenge. The winner was often rewarded with a keg of beer, or if lucky, a live duck. Depending on the generosity of the village, you see a young contestant take a giant bite of cake. His eyes roll and he slams his hands on the table. Sound like a broken bell rings in his throat, but he keeps smiling. An older woman claps her hands loudly and shouts, "It burned your lips! Well done!" The reason for these competitions, historians still debate. Some say they were a winter pastime, when fresh baked bread was rare, and those who could eat it hot were considered strong. In the same way that some cultures judged who could eat the hottest pepper to determine a mate, medieval peoples seem to have believed that those who could withstand the heat could also endure the hardships. Another view is that it was a test of male morale, proof of endurance before marriage. As one scholar once wrote wryly, some regions even held hot piping contests for the bride-to-be. Those who ate without groaning were named future family protectors. You shudder when you see a contestant whimper softly, and immediately 2 old women drag him outside, smear his face with flour to remember his weakness. But no one is really angry. Everyone laughs, shouts, and claps the table to cheer. A boy selling drinks whispers to you, "This year's cakes are baked on cherry wood. It's hotter than last year's." You walk over to the table and look closely at an untouched pie. The crust is thick, shiny brown, and almost burnt on the edges. You reach out to touch it and pull back because it's hot, man next to. You laughs heartily and thrusts a piece of cloth into your hand. Try a bite if you dare. You refuse, at least this time. Just then, the church bells rang. The last contestant raised his head, swallowed the steaming cake, and slammed his fist on the table. "Done," he shouted. The stadium erupted in cheers. Cakes burst, beer spilled from glasses, and the winner was awarded a wreath of onions. You see his lips swollen, red as coal, and wonder, is this pleasure? Or a form of torture in disguise? And then you laugh. An uncontrollable laugh, because you understand, the medieval people didn't need Netflix. They had bread, they had heat, they had church bells. And they had you, stranger standing there with a surprised look on his face. You still feel the heat from those seemingly harmless baked goods in every cell of your imaginary tongue. When suddenly, a strange smoke creeps through the rocky crevices, leading you to an empty lot behind the main market. There, in the middle of the night, shimmering with firelight, a group of young men gather in a circle around a blazing pile of firewood. They don't talk normally. They shout. They laugh dryly. They bang pots. Sometimes, they screech like hungry owls. You have just entered a common, but forgotten ritual. Summon the devil at night for fun. Don't get me wrong. This isn't demon worship. It's a game like when kids today play Ouija boards or scare each other with urban horror stories, but the medievals raised it to the level of an art form, sitting around a fire, telling ghost stories, banging pots, blowing flutes out of tune, and shouting nonsense phrases like bezelfrack, come out. The leader of the ceremony, a skinny guy in a black robe that reached to his ankles, looked as if he had just emerged from the ground. He waved his arms around like a puppet with his strings cut and muttered ancient forbidden words. That, if you listened closely, sounded like a recipe for barley beer read backwards. The flames danced. The trees around them cast long shadows like ghostly arms. One of the group threw an old wooden shoe into the fire and shouted, "If you are a devil, turn this shoe into ... two shoes." No new shoes appeared, but there was mad laughter. According to a 12th century Benedictine monk, such games calling up spirits, summoning demons, playing with fire took place in villages on summer nights or before harvest. When people were both free and wanting to try their luck with the afterlife, despite the church's strict prohibition, people still performed them secretly. They didn't really believe they were summoning evil spirits, but they weren't sure they weren't either. And it was this sense of just in case that made the game so irresistible. Some historians believe that this was a collective psychological reaction to the many unexplained events of medieval life: plagues, crop failures, unexplained deaths. In the dark, by the fire, amid the banging of pots and random chants, they found a sense of control, albeit an illusion. Other scholars lean toward a pragmatic perspective. It was just an excuse for the village youth to stay up late, gather, and flirt. The darkness made things easier to happen. You remain outside the fire, hesitant. Then one of the girls turns and thrusts a copper pot into your hands. "Knock, stranger," she says, her voice a whisper but her eyes alight. "The fire will protect." You reluctantly comply, tapping the pot against the stone next to it. The signal is received. The circle shouts, a new one, as if you are the main character in their own play. The leader hands you a sprig of dried mistletoe, asking you to throw it into the fire while shouting, "No one will dream of." "Pigs tonight, you do?" The fire flickers. The girl next to you giggles. Another person starts telling a ghost story about a priest who died in a fire and came back to steal bread from the monastery. Everyone is both scared and laughing. Another story follows about a headless ghost who wanders around after slipping on a turnip peel. Gradually, you start laughing too, not because the story is believable, but because of its beautiful absurdity. There is something very real about the way medieval people held hands in the middle of the night, shouted nonsense into the fire, and believed that something magical, or at least strange, might happen. As the ceremony wound down, someone pulled out a flute and played a short tune. Everyone fell silent to listen. The sound was off-key, the flute's resin making a choked sound like a baby bird's cry. But the group sat still, eyes closed, as if listening to an angel. You stand up, slowly moving away from the fire. When you turn around, the girl is sitting in the firelight, looking at you, no longer smiling. She raises her hand and taps the pot lightly. You feel like you've been accepted into some secret ritual that history has forgotten. In the darkness, laughter and the howling wind blend together. Maybe you really did summon a demon. Or maybe you just found a part of yourself. You think things have reached their peak of weirdness after the nighttime demon summoning? Wrong, very wrong. The next morning, you follow the sound of your stomachs, drumming to a smaller market where people are gathered around to bare-chested young men, knees bent, foreheads touching, eyes wide open, sweat pouring down, and no one is moving. You stand there, frozen. Someone standing next to you explains, "It's a head-to-head fight. Whoever gets hurt first loses." You blink a few times, thinking you misheard. But no, this is aerial gama, literal head-to-head. Contest. Two men smash their foreheads together, holding that position for as long as possible, and the first to cry out in pain, back away, or faint loses. A form of witness, without wit, as the villagers call it. The man beside you, toothless and slightly squinty, snorted proudly, Last year my son kept his forehead touching for almost an hour. By the time we stopped, neither of us could. Remember who we were? No wonder. The game was so popular that in some places there were even rankings. In 13th century Yorkshire, records show there was a season of honorable head-knocking, and the winner was called D'Iron Saint. A guy nicknamed Thomas the Bulging Forehead held the record for 4 years before suffering irreversible brain injury. The drums sounded again. 2 new opponents entered the arena. They clapped each other on the shoulders, laughed loudly, and bowed their heads. Pop! The sound of skull colliding with skull spread out like the sound of a rock hitting an iron pot. You shudder, wondering what would make someone do this willingly. Some historians explain it as a legacy of ancient rituals, where touching was seen as a form of baptism or a show of allegiance. Over time, the ritual mutated into a game played by men who needed to show off their strength, but were too lazy to use a sword. Others are simpler. There are no games to play in the countryside, and fermented drinks are always plentiful. Put those 2 things together, and you have head-to-head. You look closer, the opponents don't close their eyes. They stare at each other, counting the beats in their heads. One starts shaking, the other laughs, a sweaty, needlessly confident laugh, and there's an ah, and the crowd roars. The loser is lifted up, given a piece of boiled potato too. Bring him back to life. The judge, a white-haired old woman in a skull-embroidered top hat, announced, "The winner?" He was awarded a piece of rock-hard cake and a laurel wreath made of thinly sliced radishes. You step back, still in shock. A young woman beside you giggles and whispers, "That was a great head-to-head fight. Someone fell in love with me because of that fight and married me." You glance at the girl, gap-toothed, radiant, holding a rabbit-skin fan. You just nod politely. At that moment, a boy of about 14, skinny and eager, enters the field, challenges a man twice his age. The crowd roars with encouragement. Want to intervene? But then stop. Everyone here knows the rules. They believe this is the path to glory. The impact this time was like a thunderclap. Both staggered, but neither moved. Tension, sweat, then fell at the same time, lying like broken straw dolls. Everyone clapped again. One whispered, "The 2 lose, but friendship wins." You don't know whether to laugh or cry. It's all so surreal, so medieval. In a world without television, without video games, without TikTok, the joy lies in entertaining yourself with your own head. You leave. As the next round begins, this time a head-to-head, 2 pairs playing side by side. It seems like the possibilities here are endless. Behind you, the pop sound comes again. You don't turn around. Some sounds are meant to be. Remembered, you walk out of the headbutting arena feeling odd. Your head hasn't hit anything, but it's strangely numb, probably from witnessing so many foreheads suffer such cruel fates. You think to yourself, it can't get any dumber than that. But then you hear cheering from another direction. Loud, very excited, and very wet. You walk toward the sound and come across a strange sight. Dozens of people standing around a giant mud puddle, in the middle of which are 2 men in knee-length cloaks and bell-shaped hats, holding bundles. Fresh herring. A man holding a long horn made of cow horn roared, as if calling a monster from the deep lake, then shouted loudly, "Time for the fish-throwing contest!" You frown. Fish-throwing contest? It's exactly what it sounds like. Participants throw live herrings, wet, fishy, and clumsy at moving targets, usually other people's heads. Whoever hits the most heads wins. Whoever misses 3 times in a row gets a fish smacked in the face as punishment. Yes, this is it. Fish-throwing game for fun. A real game played in the autumn in many medieval European fishing villages especially. In Scandinavia, in northern England, Some accounts record it as a ritual to get rid of the evil spirits of summer or see off the dead fish. But in reality, according to a 15th century margin note, people just wanted to throw something without getting caught. You watch a boy of about 12 prepare to throw. He swings his arms, sways to the beat of a drum, and then hurls the fish like an early Olympian. The fish flies over the head of the person across from him, hitting the referee's hat. Cheers erupt. The referee laughs, takes off his hat, and puts it back, again to tempt fate. Some historians believe that fish tossing originated as an old pagan festival game where fish symbolized luck and fertility. But more practical scholars say fish are cheap, easy to throw, and make a fun splat. Sound when hit. Another oddity. Players don't just throw fish. Some areas have a variation on the game by throwing fish after dipping them in beer. The fish are slippery, heavier, and harder to control, which means more chaos. You watch. A big guy who seems to be last year's champion take a fish, dip it in a barrel of beer, jump 3 steps forward, shout guardian fish, and miss. The fish flies like an arrow, hitting the big drum behind the court. Sound. It drummed out, and the crowd exploded in laughter. The referee nodded, still counted as a hit. The drum is a symbol of a big head. You've never seen anyone justify a bad shot. So, logically, an old man with a white beard, wiping a fish clean with his apron, tells you a strange story that years ago, a man threw a goose that was flying by and hit it in the mouth and was called the Man. Chosen by the fish, the villagers made a woodcut to commemorate the feat, although no one knew if the goose was still alive. You were invited in. A warm herring is placed in your hand, slimy, fishy, and hopeful. You step back watching a bald old man wearing an iron pot for a hat, dancing around as if to provoke. You twist your wrist, aim, and ... whoosh. The fish flew like a wet angel, glided through the air, undulating gently, then hit a child who was picking up hats outside the throwing lane. The yard was silent for a second. The child blinked, looked at the fish between his legs, and then burst out laughing. And so everyone laughed. The referee said, "A fateful throw. The child is blessed with fish." You bow your head, half ashamed, half triumphant. You may not have one. But you have just created a new legend for the village. You leave the arena as the next round begins, the fish toss. Turn around.
Ow.
Throw over your shoulder and hit. A pot of boiling soup. Whoever hits gets to eat the soup. Whoever misses gets to eat the old fish from the day before. You walk away without looking back, knowing only that in the Middle Ages, even a fish could be a source of endless joy, and you begin to see that the world doesn't need a reason to laugh. All it needs is a good shot. You have barely left the fish-throwing ground when a bell rings loudly in the wind, followed by a very orderly cheer. Very formal, very important sounding. Curiously, you follow the crowd of people gathering toward the village square. There, on a makeshift wooden platform, a crowd dressed in colorful costumes is reenacting a trial. But wait, the prisoner is a loaf of bread? You raise your eyebrows as the judge, wearing a sheep's wool wig and holding a larger than necessary stick, stands up and shouts, "This bread is condemned. Too dry, hard crust, bland filling, and smells of betrayal." The crowd wowed. You realize this is a session fake court, a serious form of medieval entertainment, where villagers judge inanimate objects, from burnt rice, spoons with missing handles, to poor quality bread. No kidding. There are many accounts of these trials in 13th, 15th century Europe, where villagers held trials for inhuman crimes like a thieving pig, a rooster that crowed at the wrong time, or an apple tree that didn't bear fruit. But what might surprise you is the atmosphere. It was as serious as a real trial, with witnesses, prosecutors, defense attorneys for the cake, and even a jury of children in paper hats. An old man in a red robe, playing the role of a prosecutor, stepped out. He pointed to the cake sitting on a wooden plate as evidence and roared, "This is the third batch of cakes yesterday. It made 3 people lose their teeth to cry and 1 swear to switch to porridge." The crowd shouted, "Hang him." The defense attorney, a young woman in a floor-length black gown, stepped forward. Holding a spoon, she said in a solemn voice, "Your Honor, bread does not choose its own baking. It is the victim of the fickle oven of the baker in love." Someone in the crowd shouted, "I know that baker. He bakes while daydreaming." The girl continued, "Look, the crust is hard, but the inside is still soft. Can we condemn a cake just because it is not perfect?" Murmurs arose. An old woman wiped away tears. A man held his stomach with laughter. The judge tapped his stick on the floor. "Jury, what do you say?" The children held up wooden boards with the word "guilty" written on them, all in unison. The judge declared, "This bread will be baked again in a hot fire for another hour. If it is still not good after that, it will be thrown into the village pond as an example." The crowd applauded as if they had just witnessed a victory of justice. You think you're dreaming? But no, this is a real cultural phenomenon, a kind of legal drama that entertains while also helping people understand the judicial process. In an era when many people were illiterate, this was a surprisingly effective way to teach the law. Some historians call it folk jurisprudence. Others simply call it legal entertainment. You stay to watch the next trial. A bucket is accused of. It's not holding water. The witness is a soaking wet man who claims, "I poured water into this bucket. It leaked like a bathroom secret." The crowd laughed, but the ritual was still performed properly. Finally, the condemned bucket was hung upside down from a tree branch for 3 days to reflect on its mistakes. You can't help but smile. Your justice doesn't need a courtroom. Just a pulpit, a few actors, and a community that believes judging a pie is worth doing. On the way out of the bread court, you hear a child say to his mother, "Tomorrow, I will bring my flat pillow to trial." The mother laughed, "But you must have proof." You think to yourself, that's the medieval spirit. Play is play, but rules are rules. Even for a poor loaf of bread, you have been out of the bread court for less than 10 minutes. When you are suddenly stopped by a crowd that is formed around the small square, there is no laughter this time, no loaves or fishes. Instead, there is an urgent murmur and a gaze fixed on a low platform where a man stands with his pants down to his knees. Before you could even feel embarrassed, you saw that he was not at all embarrassed. On the contrary, he raised his head high, clutched a roll of parchment, and began shouting loudly, "I dare anyone in the village to recite poetry. Without laughing, when I do this. Something is going on, a game of ... wits, or simply a battle against laughter. It turns out you've just stepped into an event called Serious Poetry Reading Festival. When everything is ridiculous, a strange but popular pastime in many parts of medieval Europe. The idea is simple. A person stands in the middle of a crowd, reciting an ancient poem full of morals or scripture, by being distracted by the antics around him. Whoever laughs loses. Whoever remains stoic until the end wins. Why do they do this? Some historians believe it was a way for villagers to practice emotional control and exercise in humiliation resistance, men not laughing at oddities, like a priest slipping in church or a knight being kicked by a goat. Medieval people believed that the ability to keep a straight face is a manifestation of courage. A young man stepped forward to try his hand. He wore a goose feather cap, held a book of poetry in his hand, stood up straight, and began to read. "He who walks in Darkness will see the light. Whoever eats vegetarian food will not be satisfied. Just then, 3 people below the podium began, dancing with radish puppets, making goat noises, and sprinkling flour on the reader's head. He gritted his teeth. He still continued. A humble man never falls unless he slips on a turnip. Someone in the crowd let out the first puff, and the young man burst out laughing. The reading ended with applause and the sound of flour exploding from above. Yes, someone had exploded a bag of flour just to make a scene. Next came an old woman. Everyone expected her to be more serious, but she only got to the first sentence, blessings come to those who keep silent. Then a man wearing a skirt, yes, a real skirt, came out of nowhere and blew an onion horn. The sound it made was like a strangled rooster crowing. The crowd collapsed with laughter. But the old woman did not. She continued reading, her eyes as cold as a winter lake. At the end of the story, everyone stood up and applauded. The winner was not awarded money or wine, but was called the Keeper of the Iron Face, and had the right to lightly slap anyone in the village who laughed too much that day. In my village, one 14th century scholar once wryly remarked, "It is considered a virtue to remain serious when having dried fish stuffed down your collar." Some places even made this a ritual before appointing a village chief. If you failed to keep a straight face in the face of the antics, you are not trusted to lead the people. You sit down in the front row and are given a book of poetry to participate in. The host solemnly asks, "Are you willing to keep from laughing, even if your armpits are tickled with an owl feather?" Before you could react, a hand thrust a long feather into your hand. You nodded. You start reading. The righteous walk through the snow and are not cold. Just then, a fake goose flies out of nowhere, lands on your shoulder, and makes a quack. Sound as if laughing in your face. You try very hard. You go on to the third sentence. The tongue has no legs, but can still run far. And then someone behind blew air through a bamboo tube, creating a sound that no one thought could come from an inanimate object. You burst out laughing. Laughing like you never laughed before. You are eliminated, but no one cares. You get a hug, a dried onion, as a consolation prize, and are invited to stay for the final performance of the day, stuttering poetry contest. The winner is the one who stutters the most, but still gets the point across. You leave the square as dusk falls, your mind full of images of poetry, onions, flour, and flying geese. You smile this time without reason, because amid the medieval paradoxes, you have just realized something very modern. Sometimes all you need to survive is a well-timed laugh. You think you've seen it all. Midnight demon calls, epic fish fights, merciless headbutting, and even bread trials. But the strangest thing of all awaits you on the edge of the village, where a stone circle has been drawn into the ground using wood ash, onion skins, and dried camel saliva. In the center of the circle was a low wooden bench on which an object swayed in the moonlight, a scarecrow made of straw, wearing a crown made from an old pot lid, a string of dried garlic around its neck, and children's shoes on its feet. People bowed before it. Children whispered. Adults looked solemn. Everyone seemed to believe in something. Welcome to Straw King Honor Ceremony, a bizarrely serious ritual where villagers crown an effigy as king for one night a year. And not just for show. No. They obey that Straw King. The host, an old woman wearing a patchwork jacket made from sacking, bowed to the dummy and shouted, "The first command of the Straw King, everyone must walk backwards for one stick of incense." The drums sounded. No one argued. Everyone from children to adults began to step backwards around the circle, shouting, "The king has no eyes but sees everything." You're drawn in, too. A child presses a garlic bulb into your hand, a talisman, he says. It tells you to be careful if the Straw King smiles. You look closely. No, the dummy isn't smiling. But strangely, something about that straw face makes you uneasy, as if it knows what you're thinking. The festival is ancient. Historians disagree on its origins. One theory is that it originated from pagan rituals honoring the harvest, when people gave power to the earth, symbolized by a scarecrow, to ensure a bountiful harvest. Another theory is that it was a way for villagers to relieve their tension with real power, by pretending to obey the unreasonable orders of a false king. They laughed and felt relieved. In any case, it was a night of reversals. Everyday routines were suspended, beggars were made nobles, children shouted orders at their parents, and the village headman had to carry a radish on his head during the ceremony. The second command was, anyone with curly hair must stand on one leg until the Straw King blinks. A bald man shouted, I stand for all the curly hair. And he was immediately given the title Prime Minister of Straw. You laugh. And then the third command is announced. Whoever has never been punished in the village will be thrown. Cakes, you are startled. Yes, thrown, not get to eat. A young girl was named Perfect Resident, and was promptly showered with cake by the happy crowd. She laughed heartily, covered in cream and breadcrumbs, and bowed to the Straw King as if accepting a medal. At the end of the day, the people gathered, knelt before the effigy, and shouted in unison, King of Fools, please grant us a winter that is less cold and has less pimples than last year. The host lifted the Straw King up high and said, it is time for you to rest. Then they placed the effigy on an old cart, carried it to a small hole at the base of an old tree, and buried it in the ground as if truly sending off a recently deceased king. You stood there, still holding the garlic, your heart in turmoil. There was something both absurd and sacred about that moment. A community chose to believe in absurdity, chose to laugh to heal, and chose to create a king. Just to remember that power should not be taken too seriously, the people disperse. The moonlight falls on the ground. You look back at where the Straw King was buried, only the fallen garlic vine and fresh dirt remain. And there you have it. The medievals didn't just know how to endure suffering, they also knew how to play with the unbearable. With dry bread, herring, flour, and a king made of straw, you leave the village in the night wind, your hand gently holding the garlic, your heart light. Thank you for coming along on this bizarre journey, where you, a mere mortal, have entered a world of bizarre medieval pastimes. You have witnessed headbutting as a violent meditation, throwing fish with incredible precision, judging bread as if it were a crime, and bowing before a king made of straw. Through each part, you not only see the humor and limitless creativity of the medieval people, but also feel the very human desire to find joy in a world full of deprivation, uncertainty, and sometimes cruelty they don't have. Phones or social media, but they can laugh at a dried onion, pretend to cry in front of a ridiculous court, or believe that a scarecrow can be king for a night. These pastimes are more than entertainment. They're a way to stay sane, bond with their community, and sometimes simply survive the winter. The origins of many of these festivals and practices are still debated, though some scholars believe they are remnants of ancient pagan rituals. Others believe they were cultural responses to oppression or sadness. But whatever the reason, these strange games remind us of one thing: beneath the dust of time, humans have always found ways to turn adversity into laughter, and pain into an occasion to wear silly hats and dance around scarecrows. And perhaps, in the midst of a modern world that is sometimes too serious, we also need a bit of the Straw King spirit, knowing how to laugh when things are absurd, and knowing how to live kindly even when our hands are full of flour and raw fish. Think. you for listening to the story until the last minute. Have a peaceful night. Good night.